My name is Vince Carter, and welcome to the VC3 podcast. This video does not reflect my personal political views, nor does it advocate for or against any political party, ideology, or individual office holder in the U.S. I am not offering my opinions or moral judgments. Every claim, classification, analytical framework used in this video is drawn from independent reporting by journalists, peer-reviewed scholarship by historians and political scientists, and analysis by legal experts. All sources are cited on screen and are linked in the description below. This analysis does not assess President Trump's character or intentions as President of the United States. It does not allege malice, ill will, or unlawful intent. The conclusions presented reflect the cumulative assessment of observable actions and institutional outcomes as evaluated through established academic definitions, not merely personal opinion.
The third core element of fascism is the centralization of power or the autocratization of power. Autocracy is a political regime in which power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, an autocrat, whose authority is personal, centralized, and largely unconstrained. In a true autocracy, the leader exercises control over political, economic, social, and military power and is not meaningfully subject to legal, legislative, or constitutional limits. Autocratic rule rarely appears all at once. It typically begins with the gradual weakening of checks and balances, followed by their partial or complete removal. As institutional restraints erode, power becomes concentrated within a single party or ultimately a single ruler, a dictatorship. At the same time, the ruling party or leader seeks control over other branches of government by appointing loyalists to key positions, allowing the institutions to be hijacked from within. Or they use pressure, intimidation, or the use of paramilitary or military forces may be employed to compel compliance of independent branches, reducing them into rubber stamps for the executive authority. A central objective of autocratic consolidation is the elimination of political pluralism. You got to get rid of those pesky opponents. This can occur through the outright banning of opposition parties, the criminalization of dissent, or the manipulation of electoral laws so heavily in favor of the ruling party that opposition parties, even if formally allowed to exist, have no realistic path to victory at the ballot box. An excellent modern day example: since becoming president, Vladimir Putin has consolidated authority over all branches of government and the political system in modern Russia. While modern Russia is not a fascist state, it is absolutely authoritarian. Through a series of constitutional reforms, notably in 2020, Putin reset presidential term limits, potentially extending his rule until 2036. Centralized control over regional governments and expanded presidential powers over removal of judges and control over elections have all institutionalized his power. Key institutions such as the State Duma, the Federation Council, and courts have been systematically packed with loyalists or subordinated to Kremlin control. While multiple parties technically exist, they are heavily restricted or effectively controlled in order to maintain the dominance of United Russia, which is President Putin's political party. The authorities frequently change electoral laws and the timing of elections in order to secure advantages for their preferred candidates. Opposition candidates have little chance of success in appealing these decisions or in securing a level playing field. As with past elections, Putin's 2024 re-election campaign benefited from advantages including preferential media treatment, numerous abuses of incumbency, voter coercion and intimidation, and ballot stuffing. Genuine opposition candidates against Putin were barred from participating, and the most prominent opposition politician, Alexei Navalny, suddenly died before the election in a Siberian penal colony. The first subsection of this element of fascism we'll discuss is the removal and weakening of checks and balances which concentrate power in a single leader or ruling party. The first example of this subsection is the executive branch usurping congressional war powers. At the time this section was originally drafted, President Trump had authorized military strikes against alleged narco-terrorist boats off the coast of Venezuela, resulting in approximately 83 reported deaths. Since then, the situation has escalated significantly. The Trump administration has launched a direct military raid inside of Venezuela, resulting in the capture of Nicolas Maduro and reported deaths of roughly 80 individuals. While the earlier naval strikes already raised serious constitutional and international law concerns, this subsequent operation only sharpens them, only magnifies them. A direct U.S. military action on Venezuelan territory aimed at seizing the sitting head of a state goes beyond limited enforcement of counter narcotics operations and constitutes an act of war in all but name. The core legal and constitutional issues addressed in this section, therefore, remain fully applicable, and if anything, are even more important to the situation now. Under the Constitution, the power to declare war, limited or full, belongs to Congress, not the President. This precedent of Congress controlling both limited and full scale war was established early on in our history when Congress authorized only a limited naval conflict with France, yet President Adams issued orders beyond what Congress had allowed, and the Supreme Court struck those orders down in Little v. Barrame, 1804. Only after Congress authorizes force does the commander in chief get to wield the sword of the nation. President Trump never asked Congress for permission. He hasn't provided credible evidence that these targets were who he says they were. And the president hasn't shown that these strikes constitute an armed or immediate or sudden offensive against the United States. Legal experts are already warning that these actions may violate both U.S. law and international law. The War Powers Resolution was passed to reestablish Congress's constitutional authority over war powers by ensuring collective judgment between Congress and the executive. Under the War Powers Resolution, the president may introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities or imminent hostilities only if there is a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories, its possessions, or its armed forces. In practice, however, presidents since its passing have exploited the statute. If the president does not obtain congressional approval beforehand, the War Powers Resolution allows military force to continue for up to 60 days with an additional withdrawal period, creating a de facto loophole that was never the law's intent. Rather than restraining presidential war power making, the WPR has often functioned as permission to ask first and consult Congress later, an outcome many legal scholars argue is unconstitutional. The Trump administration has now blown past that deadline, which legal experts argue the continued use of force unlawful. While presidents of both parties have gradually eroded Congress's war-making authority, from President Truman's intervention in Korea without congressional approval, to President Bush's expanding executive war powers to include a preemptive war doctrine, read the political cartoon on screen. It sums it up perfectly. And to President Obama's illogical argument that dropping bombs on a nation does not somehow constitute hostilities. Yet, the Trump administration has taken that erosion to a new extreme, arguing that drug dealers are the same thing as terrorists, and dropping bombs on a foreign nation and kidnapping their head of state, fairly elected or not, is somehow not an act of war, but is instead a simple and routine police action. All of this without any congressional approval. These strikes don't just violate the Constitution. They set a dangerous precedent that future presidents of either party will exploit. If a president can unilaterally decide that a handful of suspected drug books constitute a national emergency, then the concept of congressional war-making authority becomes meaningless. This is how presidential war powers spiral out of control and Congress becomes irrelevant. And one individual, the president, becomes the sole decider on taking our nation of 330 million people to war. The sole decider when American men and women put their lives in jeopardy. How many times in U.S. history has the president dragged the U.S. into a war of the American people were not in favor of, and which became a strategic blunder. Do we not want to learn from our mistakes and guard against repeating them? Some supporters will argue, well, isn't the president the commander in chief? Doesn't that mean he can bomb drug cartels or anyone else whenever he wants? Isn't that how our government and our constitution works? No, that's not how the constitution works, nor was it what the founders established. The commander in chief clause is not a blank check for offensive warfare. Here is a direct quote from Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers 69, explaining to the country the powers of the new presidency. Secondly, the president is to be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. In this respect, his authority would be nominally the same of that of the King of Great Britain, but in substance much inferior to it. It would amount to nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces as first general and admiral of the Confederacy, while that of the British king extends to declaring war and the raising and regulating of fleets and armies, all of which by the Constitution under consideration would appertain to the legislature, to Congress. This quote is especially important because it contrasts the president with the British king, where the king has the power to declare war, whereas our president simply has the power of being the first admiral and general of our military. Nothing more. That's it. If that isn't enough to persuade you, during the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the meeting where the founders hammered out the Constitution and defined what it would actually mean, the delegates debated this idea of to declare war, to make war. And here's what they said. The idea of giving the president the power to make war on his own was initially floated by Pierce Butler, but the other founders quickly shut it down. Elbridge Gerry was reportedly shocked that such a power was even being proposed for our new constitutional republic. The founders made their reasoning clear. The president's authority would be limited to repelling quote unquote sudden attacks, not initiating war on his own. They argued the president could not be trusted with the power of war. They argued that many times in the Federalist Papers. But for that reason, they deliberately settled on the language that Congress had the power to declare war. They did so in order to draw a clear line between defensive war against sudden attacks that the president may take his constitutional right and the constitutional authority of Congress to authorize offensive war. Look, I can already hear some of you typing in the comments right now and yelling at your screen. Striking drug smugglers is the same as defensive war. Those drugs are killing our people. Drugs are a serious issue. They take the lives of tens of thousands of Americans every year. But they are not the same thing as a sudden attack against our country. I know, crazy idea, but here's why. Americans must willingly purchase these drugs with money from these traffickers. And traffickers have every incentive to keep their clients alive. Whereas a sudden attack against our country is fundamentally different. It involves the intent to kill as many Americans as possible against their will, or to conquer the country itself. Comparing these two things together is absolutely ludicrous and void of any intellectual honesty. So let's stop pretending. Additionally, the founders had ships. They understood maritime threats. They were familiar with smuggling. And nowhere in their writings did they ever articulate that drug trafficking rose to the level of a sudden attack against the nation, no matter how hard, no matter how much we want to twist their words. We all need to stop trying to twist the Constitution and redefine the meaning of words to fit our goals. If we continue down this path, then the Constitution itself becomes meaningless. Without our Constitution, we will no longer be united by its values nor live in America. We'll become something entirely foreign and ruined, and our liberties and freedoms will always be threatened. To wrap this up with a clean analogy, the Constitution deliberately divides war powers between Congress and the president. Congress alone has the authority to declare war or engage offensive war, limited or full. Only after Congress has authorized force against another nation may the president then wield the sword of war by directing the military as the commander in chief. But once that conflict ends through victory or congressional settlement, the president must take that sword and sheath it, never to draw it again unless Congress authorizes it. The only time the president may draw the sword on his own accord is if the country is suddenly attacked. That's it. The next example we'll discuss is the expansion of emergency powers. In 1952, Justice Robert H. Jackson warned in Youngstown v. Sawyer about the abuse of emergency powers by the executive. Quote, our forefathers knew what emergencies were, how they afford a ready pretext for usurpation. Emergency powers tend to kindle emergencies. That warning has never felt more relevant. In 2025 alone, President Trump has declared or invoked 13 separate emergencies: border emergencies, energy emergencies, crime emergencies, tariff emergencies, guard mobilizations, and even national security powers aimed at drug cartels. This level of emergency activity is unprecedented in modern American history. You would think this was World War II, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and the sky falling down all on our heads all at once with the amount of emergencies. But experts warn it's not. They claim it's one president turning extraordinary powers into routine governing tools, and that's the issue. Experts warn that when emergency powers become a governing strategy instead of a rare exception, the Constitution starts bending around the presidency. Instead, Constitution limiting and constraining the actions of the president. These declarations bypass Congress, weaken states' rights, and allow the president to mobilize the military, impose tariffs, freeze funds. In a healthy democracy, emergency powers are rarely used. Under the Trump administration, they're becoming the default solution to every political and policy dispute. And once a president learns he can bypass Congress simply by uttering the word emergency, that temptation never goes away. Quoting Senator Rand Paul speaking on the Senate floor about Trump's emergency powers, everywhere! There's an emergency everywhere! Sounds like an emergency everywhere is an emergency nowhere.
An emergency has been declared, as the senator from Virginia remarked, everywhere. There's an emergency everywhere. Sounds like an emergency everywhere is really an emergency nowhere.
In the next example, we'll discuss political gerrymandering ordered by the president explicitly for Republican advantage. President Trump has publicly pressured Republican-led states to redraw congressional districts mid-decade to secure additional Republican seats in the U.S. House of Representatives.
On Texas, how many more seats do you want the Republicans to draw?
5.
And then what if California, New York, Illinois, and other blue states?
Yeah, well, that's okay too, but 5. I think we get 5. And there could be some other states. We're going to get another 3 or 4 or 5 in addition. Texas would be the biggest one, and
so
that'll be 5.
Are you calling then for a complete redrawing of the congressional map ahead of next year?
Just a very simple redrawing. We pick up 5 seats. But we have a couple of other states where we'll pick up seats also.
I won Texas. I got the highest vote in the history of Texas, as you probably know. And we are entitled to 5 more seats.
States like Texas, Missouri, North Carolina, and Utah have already moved or are actively moving to pass new, aggressively gerrymandered maps. In Texas and North Carolina alone, experts estimate these changes could net Republicans at least 6 new House seats. The Constitution gives the states the primary authority to run federal elections, and no president has ever demanded that states redraw congressional districts specifically to entrench one party's control over Congress. And while the Supreme Court ruled in Ruchel v. Common Cause 2019 that partisan gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles, let me repeat that, incompatible with democratic principles, but outside the reach of the federal courts, That decision did not give presidents the power to direct states to manipulate district lines for their own political gain. So while the new maps may be technically legal, the scale, timing, and openly partisan nature of this push is unprecedented in modern American history. At best, the president's call for mid-decade partisan gerrymandering will trigger a nationwide escalation where Republican and Democratic states redraw maps again and again and again, each trying to counter each other's move and balance out the amount of House seats given up. An all-out war where more states jump into the fray like World War I. A redistricting arm race where neither side wants to fall behind and is compelled to redraw their lines. The consequence of these actions were obvious from the start. Competitive districts disappear, extremists win safe primaries, and millions of Americans lose meaningful representation. Let me repeat that one more time. Because of the call to redistrict by the President of the United States, millions of Americans on the left and on the right will lose their right to meaningfully be represented in Congress. What a shame. The Brennan Center's analysis of 2024 House elections showed that partisan maps, especially in states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio, have already tilted the playing field toward Republicans by 16 seats before President Trump demanded the new decade redraws. These maps only deepen that imbalance. At worst, this becomes a path to de facto single-party dominance of the U.S. House of Representatives, even if Republicans lose the national popular vote. Because the House controls federal spending, taxation, investigations, and impeachment, losing competitive representation means losing meaningful checks on power. Once one party entrenches itself through manipulated maps, the principle of free and fair representation, the cornerstone of our constitutional republic, and what the Republican Party is named after, begins to disappear. Some may argue that the president is balancing out Democratic gerrymandering, that red states are just doing what blue states do. But that argument collapses immediately under the facts. First, Republicans already start every congressional cycle with a built-in structural advantage, even before any map is drawn. In 2023, a PNAS study found that because Democratic voters are heavily concentrated in cities, Democrats face an 8-seat disadvantage on geography alone. Republicans don't start from behind, they start from ahead. When you include the 2024 Brennan study, that advantage may be as high as 16 seats. Second, mid-decade gerrymandering is almost unheard of. States usually redraw maps once every decade after the census. When maps change mid-cycle, it's almost always because a court ordered it, not because a president demanded it for partisan gain. What's happening now is not a routine both sides issue. It's a break from the guardrails that have stabilized redistricting in our country for a century. Third, when all states redraw maps at the same time after the census, political extremes naturally balance each other out. That safeguard disappears when the president pressures only his states to redraw maps mid-decade. It becomes unilateral and dangerously unbounded. Finally, and this is the key, no modern president has ever openly demanded partisan gerrymandering to secure more seats in Congress. Not Obama, not Bush, not Clinton, not Reagan. Trump is the first president to insert himself directly into redistricting and to tell states to redraw maps specifically to help his party win the House of Representatives. The next example we'll discuss is the Trump administration's attempt to control federal elections. In 2025, President Trump issued Executive Order 14248, preserving and protecting the integrity of American elections. It directs federal agencies to require ballots in federal elections be cast and received by Election Day, eliminating many late-arriving mail ballots even when they are mailed on time. It pressures states to require voter-verifiable paper records and restricts machines relying only on barcodes or QR codes. It also mandates proof of U.S. citizenship for voter registration. And most importantly, this executive order threatens to withhold federal funds from states that refuse these conditions. Legal experts warn the order exceeds presidential authority under the Elections Clause of the Constitution, which assigns election administrations to the states and Congress, not the president. I just want you to take a second and think about the consequences of this. If a president can unilaterally dictate the rules for federal elections, deadlines, registration requirements, and funding conditions, the system becomes vulnerable to manipulation by the very candidate who benefits the most from the outcome, the President of the United States. The democratic principle at stake is basic. No candidate should control the rules of the election they're competing in, especially not the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States. Some supporters will argue that these changes increase election security, so who cares if the president abuses his authority to achieve these goals? But this is not about political preference. These policies might be amazing, but they should not be decided by a single man or woman who could use this power one day to manipulate the rules for his advantage. I don't know how else to explain the danger of that outcome.
Whenever I'm at a loss for words, I look to the words of our founding generation. Joseph Story, who I've quoted very often, explained that during the framing of the Constitution, the founders debated three ways of protecting our elections. First, by vesting the power entirely in Congress. Second, entirely in the states. And finally, primarily in the states, with Congress acting only as a backstop in emergencies. They chose the latter. And that choice is reflected in our Constitution right now, as you've seen all throughout this video. From this passage, you might notice that something is missing. Something critical is missing. The founders do not even contemplate giving the executive branch any role in controlling our elections. They never once mention the presidency, never once say an executive order can order the states or Congress to do anything with our elections. Additionally, you'll notice that the first generations of Americans were so fearful of federal interference in elections that when the Constitution was first ratified, many were angry and alarmed that Congress was given any role at all. They were angry at Congress, that Congress had a role. Joseph Story notes that this provision caused terror and alarm among the people. This fear was expressed very clearly in the Anti-Federalist Papers. Very quickly, for those of you who do not know what the Anti-Federalist Papers are, they are a collection of essays written by members of the founding generation who opposed the ratification of the Constitution. They ultimately lost the ratification battle, but they had a major impact, a significant impact. They fought for stronger limits and restraints on federal power, and most famously, their arguments are the entire reason why we have a Bill of Rights. So they may have lost the battle, but they didn't lose the war. On screen, you can read their words and see just how deep this fear of federal control over elections was to them. When we put the Constitution itself, Joseph Story's writings, and the Anti-Federalist Papers together, we reach a clear conclusion. The states are primarily responsible for running elections, and only in limited or emergency circumstances does Congress have a role to step in. Importantly, the President of the United States has zero constitutional authority over our elections.
If we normalize a precedent that a president can override those guardrails, future presidents inherit the same power. If you support these reforms that are being proposed by the Trump administration, the constitutional route is through the state legislators and Congress, not unilateral executive orders that can turn our president into a king. We have already discussed these examples in previous elements of fascism, but they apply here too. Emergency National Guard deployments against Americans, the politicization of the U.S. military, circumventing freedom of speech. A few of these next examples will be discussed in the next subsection, but they also apply here as well. The crackdown of Pentagon press freedom or freedom of press violations, the removal and replacement of judge advocate generals or JAGs, violating due process, unilateral tariffs against the globe, the attempted removal and replacement of Federal Reserve leadership, subsection scoring. Checks and balances have not been fully dismantled, but they have been repeatedly attacked and significantly weakened through executive pressure, violations of long-standing norms, and efforts to bypass institutional constraints. While these safeguards continue to function, they do so under sustained strain and significant pressure. Therefore, this section is scored as partially observed. The next subsection we'll discuss is control of branches of government and the military via loyalists or intimidation. The first example of this subsection are the loyalists appointed to key cabinet positions early on in this administration. At the beginning of this term, President Trump appointed individuals to top military and law enforcement positions who had lacked conventional qualifications but demonstrated ideological and personal loyalty. These people were anti-woke, committed to shaking up the establishment, and aligned with avenging perceived injustices and attacks against the president. All of these individuals were confirmed by the Senate on very slim margins that aligned with party lines, and even some of them had to be settled with a tie-breaking vote by Vice President Vance. We're talking about appointments like Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and Attorney General Pam Bondi. When I researched my YouTube video, Trump's Presidential Cabinet in Honest Review, I found that in President Trump's first term, the president either fired or pushed out at least 2 directors of national intelligence, 2 attorney generals, and 2 secretary of defenses, replacing qualified officials because they would not comply with unreasonable or unlawful demands. Here are some of their words.
4-star Marine general was asked if Trump was a fascist and replied, quoting here, "He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist for sure."
McMaster never considered Trump dangerous, but the president's affinity for autocrats made him uneasy.
President Trump sees in authoritarian leaders the qualities that he wants other people to see in him.
Vladimir Putin in particular.
He would appeal to the president's desire for flattery. He would appeal to the president's skepticism about long-term military commitments abroad. He encouraged an attack, on the first branch of government.
They broke the glass. Everybody stay down. Get down.
And an attack on the peaceful transition of power, and I think that was an abandonment of his responsibilities to the Constitution.
We did not have a common value system. When the president would say, well, here's what I want to do, and here's how I want to do it. And I'd have to say to him, well, Mr. President, I understand what you want to do, but you can't do it that way. It violates the law. It violates a treaty. He got really frustrated. I didn't know how to conduct my affairs with him any other way than in a very straightforward fashion. And I think he grew tired of me being the guy every day that told him you can't do that.
Quote, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. This will not be easy, as the past few days have shown, but we owe it to our fellow citizens, to past generations that bled to defend our promise, and to our children. And he concludes, quote, we know that we are better than the abuse of executive authority that we witnessed in Lafayette Square. We must reject and hold accountable those in office who would make a mockery of our Constitution.
In newly revealed conversations between General Milley and the author Bob Woodward, written about in Bob Woodward's new book, War, General Milley felt compelled to clarify and articulate his concern about the future of our country should Donald Trump ever return to power. He cornered Bob Woodward at a 200-person reception in March 2023 and said this, quote, he is the most dangerous person ever. I had suspicions when I talked to you about his mental decline, and so forth. But now I realize he's a total fascist. He is the most dangerous person to this country, end quote. A fascist to the core, General Milley repeated. Bob Woodward said he will never forget the intensity of Milley's worry in that moment.
Experts argue when key government positions are filled based on loyalty rather than competence, the best case outcome is poor decision making. The worst case outcome is a cabinet of yes men who fail to challenge unlawful or unconstitutional actions. In either scenario, institutional power concentrates around the president, weakening the guardrails and internal checks designed to prevent authoritarian drift. Democratic erosion rarely happens all at once. It unfolds appointment after appointment, gradually hollowing out the expertise and independence, and then accelerates once those inside the system no longer serve as the backstop against abuse of power. When internal resistance disappears, constitutional violations become easier, faster, and more routine. Some supporters argue that the president learned from his first term and now wants officials who share his agenda rather than bureaucrats who might stop it. But ideology is not a substitute for competence, wisdom, and expertise, especially at the highest levels of our government. If the goal were faithful execution of policy, the president could appoint leaders who both support his agenda and possess the experience necessary to run complex national departments. When loyalty becomes the primary qualification, cabinets stop functioning as centers of expert governance and instead become instruments of personal authority. Internal debate diminishes. Professional judgment is sidelined, and officials are incentivized to please the president rather than provide candid advice or uphold legal constitutional constraints. That shift weakens institutional guardrails and accelerates the erosion of our democracy, regardless of the policies being pursued. It fundamentally transforms a cabinet into a court, one that exists to please the king rather than serve the people, advise the president, and protect the Constitution. The next example we'll discuss is the revival of Schedule F, which would provide the president the ability to purge the civil service in favor of loyalists. In line with Project 2025, President Trump reviewed and rebranded Schedule F through Executive Order 14171, restoring accountability to policy influencing positions within the federal workplace. The order directs agencies to reclassify tens of thousands of policy influencing civil service roles into a new category with reduced protections, meaning instead of requiring for cause to fire these individuals, for cause is the legal requirement that they can only lose their job for poor performance, misconduct, corruption, etc. The president's executive order is attempting to reclassify these employees to be fired at will. For no reason they can be fired. The Office of the Management and Budget, OMB, which is under the executive branch and run by Russell Vought, who was one of the central architects of Project 2025, began implementation in early 2025, and the administration has estimated that roughly 50,000 federal positions could be reclassified and fired at will. Legal experts warn this enables loyalty-based purges and gives the White House unprecedented control over the federal workforce. Thus, the federal government can quickly turn from a professional government into a personal government that enacts the will of a single man or single ideology. As of 2025, litigation is ongoing in a D.C. federal court and the legal status remains contested. Some supporters say that civil servants have acted like political activists and blocked President Trump's first term agenda. But if that's actually true, then why doesn't the Trump administration just prove it in court? The way the law already allows. Why skip due process entirely and turn civil servants into personal lackeys for any presidency? Additionally, just think about the hypocrisy of this argument. The federal government is too biased one way, so how about instead we make it completely biased towards the opposite party? How does that solve any of our problems? It doesn't. All it does is continue the erosion of our constitutional republic and strips power and representation away from the people and turns government run for a single individual or a single ideology. The next example is the removal and replacement of the top judge advocate generals, or JAGs is what I'll be calling them, in the military. President Trump has fired or forced the resignations of all three top judge advocate generals of the Army and Air Force. A move with no precedence in a modern American history. The JAG Corps has always been one of the most apolitical parts of the military, filled with career legal experts who serve under Republican and Democratic administrations alike to protect service members enforce the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and ensure the United States follows the law of war. Far more concerning is the commissioning of President Trump's former personal lawyer, Timothy Parlatore, in the Navy Reserve JAG Corps, and his rapid placement inside the Secretary of Defense inner circle at the same time the administration is pushing major changes to the military justice system. Parlatore is not a career JAG who rose through the military legal pipeline. He is best known as a private attorney with close political ties, including his role in the Eddie Gallagher case. Inserting President Trump's former personal lawyer into a uniformed legal role during a broader effort to reshape the JAG Corps raises serious concerns about the politicalization and independence of military legal advice. Additionally, Secretary of Defense Pete Seth has openly criticized lawyers as obstacles to commanders' decision-making, stating it's about removing roadblocks to orders given by the commander-in-chief. Experts warn that politicizing the JAG Corps and appointing personal lawyers undermines one of the military's most important internal legal guardrails. The roadblocks that Secretary of Defense Hegseth cited are not a flaw in the system. They are a safeguard. The role of military lawyers is to ensure orders are lawful, prevent war crime exposure, protect both service members and civilian leadership from illegal actions, and maintain constitutional loyalty. Replacing independent legal leadership with political allies will very likely place every service member in jeopardy. It can lead to a system where illegal commands can be rubber stamped as legal, where troops may be pressured to violate their oath, and where the military's internal checks and balances eventually collapse. Some supporters will argue, well, the president has the authority to remove JAGs. What's the big deal? Or they'll say these officers were appointed by Democrats, so replacing them is justified. That argument completely misses the point. The issue isn't whether the president can fire them, it's whether replacing career, apolitical military lawyers with political allies makes the military safer, more lawful, or more stable. Experts warn, pretty logically, it doesn't. Career JAGs serve under multiple administrations because they understand military law better than anyone, and because their independence protects the military force from legal abuse. If the outgoing JAGs were truly unqualified, why replace them with some people who have never practiced military law or have minimal experience? Why give President Trump's personal lawyer influence over reshaping the entire JAG Corps? Eroding the independence of the military legal leadership weakens the rule of law inside the armed forces. When the people who are supposed to know when to say no are replaced with people who will only very likely say yes, the military becomes vulnerable to the very abuses our system and our Constitution was designed to prevent. The next example is how the Department of Defense, or War, is cracking down on freedom of press and at the Pentagon. The Department of Defense is now requiring the Pentagon press corps, journalists, and media networks to sign a pledge stating they will not solicit or publish any information, including unclassified information, unless it has already been pre-approved by the government. Most major press outlets have already been evicted from the Pentagon, leaving only a handful of reporters inside the building, which just so happens to be far-right news outlets, smaller opportunistic outlets, and MAGA loyalists. This pledge effectively turns military reporting into a government-filtered, government-sponsored information pipeline instead of reporting on the cold, hard truth and asking tough questions the American people need answered by their government. Legal experts and press freedom groups argue that this kind of sweeping pre-approval violates the First Amendment's protection of a free press, and the Associated Press has sued the Trump administration over this. If the press cannot report on any military activity without Pentagon approval, Even basic unclassified operations, troop conditions, readiness issues, budget problems, procurement failures, or leadership misconduct, then the press is no longer independent. For a country where the military consumes the largest portion of the federal budget and where millions of Americans serve in uniform or a family who do, the public has a right to know what is happening inside the armed forces. Transparency, not secrecy, is the model the Constitution demands. Some supporters argue that this is just about stopping leaks or protecting sensitive information. But that makes no sense. We already have laws with serious penalties for leaking classified information, such as the Espionage Act of 1917. If the issue were generally about national security, the government can simply enforce existing law or tighten access to classified information so less people can get to it. Instead, the Department of Defense is cracking down on the free press and making it effectively illegal to even ask about unclassified information. That is not security. Come a little closer. That's censorship. And since government corruption, misconduct, and abuse are almost always hidden, restricting press access only increases the chance that wrongdoing goes unchecked. Furthermore, the U.S. military belongs to the American people. Our sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers put their lives on the line for the country. The public has a fundamental right to know what is going on in the Pentagon, and the First Amendment forbids this kind of prior restraint. Another example that would fall under this subsection is the replacement of the Bureau of Labor Statistics chief, an example that we discussed in Core Element 1. Go watch that section if you want to learn about it. Subsection Score. While the executive has not achieved full control over the other branches of government or the military, the executive branch has made sustained efforts to install loyalists in key positions, weaken internal safeguards, and reduce institutional independence. These efforts reflect an active pursuit of control rather than onesies or twosies or accidents, but full consolidation remains incomplete. Accordingly, this indicator is scored as partially observed. The next subsection this element of fascism will be covering is ending pluralism. The first example of this is the Trump administration using the tools of the government to target the Democratic Party. The Trump administration has repeatedly used the machinery of the federal government to punish the Democratic Party in states that voted against the sitting president. During the government shutdown, official federal resources were weaponized to blame Democrats, including politicized website pop-ups, partisan out-of-office auto-replies, and broadcasts at airports telling travelers the shutdown was the Democrats' fault. The District Court for D.C. ruled that the out-of-office replies violated the First Amendment, while as of this writing, those other instances have not had legal rulings on them yet. Outside the shutdown, President Trump has routinely threatened to withhold federal funds from Democratic states unless they comply with the Trump administration's demands. During the 2025 California wildfires, which burned billions of dollars worth of homes, directly killed 30 people, and contributed to more than 400 additional deaths, the Trump administration told California it could lose federal funding unless it enacted Trump's preferred voter ID laws and changed its water right policies. At the same time, wildfire management funds were frozen. New York had $18 billion in infrastructure funding threatened to be cut or temporarily blocked, including the Hudson River Tunnel and subway expansion, which President Trump dismissed as Democratic projects. And after the election of Zohran Mamdani, who Trump called a communist and Mamdani called Trump a fascist, President Trump threatened to withhold all federal funding to New York except for the legal minimum. This is American taxpayer money. More recently, the president has also vetoed a bill that would help create clean water in the state of Colorado. The reasoning for this was twofold. First, it was a reaction against the Democratic governor for not releasing Tina Peters, who engaged in electoral system tampering in 2020. And it was also likely political retribution against Republican Representative Lauren Boebert for signing the Epstein Transparency Act discharge petition. This shows that the president is more than willing to use the power of the government against the Democrats and is showing a new willingness to even use it against Republicans who go against his personal will. This sends a chilling message to Congress. All political dissent will be punished. Using the machinery of the federal government to punish one political party in opposition-led states undermines political pluralism, undermines our democracy, our constitutional republic. When official communications and federal funds are weaponized for partisan purposes, The government stops acting as a neutral institution and becomes an enforcement tool for the executive. Conditioning disaster relief, infrastructure funding, or essential services on political compliance turns public resources into leverage. Over time, this coerces the states into federal control, which violates states' rights, distorts democratic competition, and concentrates power in the presidency by making political dissent materially costly. Some supporters argue this is normal political pressure or legitimate leverage to ensure good policy. But there is a clear difference between advocating for policy and using government power to punish political opponents. Federal funds are appropriated by Congress to serve the public, to serve all Americans, not to reward loyalty or punish dissent. When a president selectively threatens or withholds funding from opposition states, governance becomes coercive and gives way to executive dominance instead of our democratic republic. The president is supposed to be the president of all Americans, not just the ones who agree with him. The president works for all of us. The next example, political gerrymandering for Republican advantage, was discussed in this video in the first subsection, but it fits perfectly in this category as well. Final example, the politicalization of the U.S. military, which was discussed in the first core element of fascism, also fits here too. Subsection scoring. Political pluralism has not been formally abolished in the U.S., but sustained legal and institutional pressure on the opposition extends beyond mere rhetoric. We're seeing the government do it. Opposition parties continue to operate and compete, though under increasing strain and increasing constraints. Because pluralism persists despite meaningful pressure, this subsection is scored as partially observed. The next subsection this element of fascism we'll discuss is the leader and party placed above the Constitution. The first example of this is the vast number of pardons this administration has provided for loyalists already. President Trump has issued pardons and communications to political loyalists, including roughly 1,500 January 6 defendants. Importantly, over 400 of them were convicted of violent crimes such as assaulting, resisting, or impeding law enforcement, and they all still got a pardon. The Trump administration has also commuted the sentence of former MAGA Representative George Santos, who defrauded the very voters who elected him, stealing identities, including from elderly victims, to bankroll his campaign and finance a personal lifestyle of luxury spending, which included purchasing luxury clothing, paying his credit card bills, his rent, and personal expenses. Santos's crime involved at least $375,000 in fraud. President Trump has also pardoned Changping Zhao, whose company Binance paid $4.3 billion after pleading guilty to systemic anti-money laundering and sanctions violations that allowed criminals, drug traffickers, and sanctioned actors to move billions through the platform undetected. President Trump also pardoned former Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was sentenced to 45 years for trafficking after a U.S. jury found that he used his office to protect and facilitate the trafficking of more than 400 tons of cocaine bound for the United States. Prosecutors proved Hernandez accepted millions of dollars in bribes from drug cartels, deployed Honduran security forces to shield traffickers, and turned an entire state into a narco corridor, directly fueling violence, addiction, and organized crime in the U.S. Just a quick side note, these are the same exact sins the president has claimed against Nicolas Maduro, who the president launched a military assault on the capital of Venezuela to capture. Just think about this. One gets a pardon while the other sits in prison for the same crimes. I wonder why. President Trump also issued a pre-trial pardon to Representative Henry Seller, who had been indicted on federal charges alleging he accepted roughly $600,000 in bribes from foreign state-linked energy companies and a Mexican bank. The pardon halted the case before any evidence could be tested in court, shielding an elected official accused of selling his office from public accountability. Finally, Tina Peters, a former county clerk in Colorado, was convicted in a state court for election-related crimes after deliberately and illegally breaching and compromising election equipment during the 2020 election. Peters bypassed security procedures, facilitated the copying and public release of confidential voting system data, passwords, and software, and promoted the breach as proof of election fraud. What unites these pardons is not mercy, rehabilitation, or justice. It's loyalty, alignment, or political usefulness for President Trump. For example, former Rep. George Santos, self-described MAGA Republican, who publicly supported President Trump and amplified his narratives while defrauding his own voters and donors. Former Honduran President Hernandez, after his conviction, wrote a letter to President Trump titled, "Your Excellency," filled with flattery, and explicitly framed his prosecution as the work of Joe Biden and the radical left, portraying himself as a victim of the same forces he claimed were coming after Trump, aligning his criminal case with Trump's political grievance narrative that he uses here in the U.S. Crypto billionaire Changpeng Zhao operated a company with documented financial and commercial ties to the Trump-linked crypto ventures, specifically to President Trump's son crypto venture called World Liberty Financial, making his pardon materially beneficial to President Trump. And while Representative Teller is a Democrat, Trump made it clear in a True Social post that loyalty, not party, was the expectation, openly expressing frustration that Seller did not flip parties or exit politics. Tina Peters was acting on the false conspiracy theory that Dominion voting machines were manipulating election results, a claim that has been repeatedly debunked by courts, audits, and election security experts, but one that President Trump and senior figures aligned with this administration publicly promoted before and after the 2020 election. President Trump and his allies have since applied rhetorical pressure on Colorado officials, labeling Peters as a political prisoner and condemning those involved in her conviction, stating that they may rot in hell. Looking at all of these cases together, they reveal a consistent logic. Criminal severity is irrelevant when loyalty is demonstrated, when grievance narratives are echoed, when flattery is bestowed upon the president, or personal and political interests aligned. The pardon power is no longer exercised as a safeguard against injustice, but instead as a reward, signaling that allegiance to the president can outweigh accountability to the law. Legal experts warn this kind of loyalty-based clemency shatters people's faith in the justice system. It tells the country that accountability doesn't matter, only allegiance does. And it creates a massive incentive for political allies to keep committing crimes because experience has already shown them the playbook. Break the law on behalf of the administration, get a pardon later. We are already seeing this play out in the real world. Multiple individuals who were pardoned for their roles in the January 6th attack have been arrested or charged with new serious crimes, including sexual abuse, burglary, and theft, aggravated DUI leading to reckless homicide, and illegal gun possessions. Some pardoned defendants had prior convictions for rape, sexual abuse of a minor, manslaughter, and drug trafficking that remain on record. One pardoned rioter was later convicted in a separate case of conspiring to murder FBI agents who investigated him. A lot of these people, especially the Jan 6ers, view themselves as superstars and rock stars, and they wear their pardon like a badge of honor. These actions erode public trust and appear to protect loyalty over the rule of law. Some people will say that, well, Biden pardoned his son and a bunch of his allies too, so Trump is just doing what Democrats did. And look, nobody's pretending Biden's pardons were clean or justified. A lot of people across the political spectrum were frustrated, disappointed, horrified, and angry at President Biden's blanket pardons. When these pardons were given, I called out the Biden administration on my Instagram. Here's the key though. One president abusing the system does not give the next president a free pass to do the same thing, and especially on a bigger scale. That's not how you defend justice. That's how you destroy it. Of course, the president's pardon power is absolute, but absolute does not automatically mean righteous. Millions of Americans across the political spectrum are losing hope in our system that continues to reward loyalists. Many experts argue that the pardon power must be reformed if we want to begin to restore justice in our political system. The next example we'll discuss is how the administration has just generally ignored the U.S. Constitution and federal law at alarming levels. Legal experts argue that the president has repeatedly violated the Constitution and federal law, with Legal Eagle estimating roughly 200 legal violations by the Trump administration in 2025 alone. That's 16.5 violations of the Constitution and law a month, or 4 a week. One of the clearest examples was when the president openly defied Supreme Court order and refused to return Abreu Garcia to the United States for 3 full months. That refusal persisted despite the court's clear directive and despite the administration's acknowledgement that the removal violated due process requirements. When a president can openly defy a Supreme Court order for months without consequence, or allow an agency that it oversees to violate court orders repeatedly, the Constitution stops functioning as a binding constraint and becomes optional in practice. Review by the courts only works if the executive branch complies with it. Once that compliance breaks down, the separation of powers collapses with it. The courts lose their ability to check executive overreach, and constitutional limits become suggestions rather than enforceable rules. The danger is not a single violation, but normalization. If ignoring a Supreme Court ruling is tolerated once, it becomes easier to do it again for longer periods, in more serious cases, and against more people. If the Trump administration can ignore a Supreme Court order for 3 months, how about 6? How about 9? How about a year? This is how constitutional democracies erode, not through a sudden coup, but through repeated acts of defiance that slowly reset expectations about what the president is allowed to do. And the president continues to get away with it. Some supporters may dismiss this as a slippery slope argument, claiming one violation doesn't mean authoritarianism is inevitable. And it's not inevitable. But this isn't speculative. It's already happening. The Supreme Court order was ignored for months in real time. The Constitution only works if all branches agree to follow it. When the executive can selectively comply without consequence, the system is already being compromised. The real fallacy is pretending constitutional violations are temporary or harmless when they establish illegal precedent and invite repetition by the current administrations and future administrations to abuse. Subsection scoring. The Constitution has not been formally suspended or rewritten, but executive actions increasingly treat legal accountability as optional. Loyalty-based pardons, selective enforcement, and repeated defiance or delay in complying with the courts are weakening the rule of law and signal impunity for the ruler and his loyalists. While courts and constitutional structures continue to function and impose limits, their authority is under sustained pressure. Accordingly, this subsection is scored as partially observed. Total section scoring. Adding all of these sections up together, we get a total score for this full section of 3.5 out of 8 points, or 43.8%. While this is the 4th highest scoring category by percentage, it ranks the highest in terms of raw score.
It's a 10-episode project, but the core of this analysis is built around 7 elements of fascism. Episode 1 is focused on framework and the underlying model, so you understand exactly how I arrive at my conclusions at the end of this series. Episode 2 lays the foundation by defining fascism and outlining the global regime types we'll be comparing against. Episode 3 through 9 examine one of the 7 core elements, 1 element per episode, with multiple subsections for each, all evaluated using the same scoring every time. This is the meat and potatoes of the analysis. In the final episode, all of these scores are brought together and we answer the question once and for all, is the United States drifting towards fascism?